Good afternoon once again. Hopefully everybody's signed on. I'd like to say today I'm extremely fired up to talk about the lowdown on protection classes 1 through 10. It's interesting that as we get into property insurance, we talk about this. This is something that affects all real property and inland marine property across the United States. And it seems to be a little bit misunderstood, so that's why we decided to create this webinar and talk about it. Little housekeeping issues. We're going to go through this pretty quick today. It's not that many screens. Tell you a few stories, and then at the end of the webinar, we will open it up to answer any of your questions, because we try to make these things as real life as possible. These are educational-based webinars, so it's not as though we're pushing a particular product. This is just to talk about things that impact builder's risk. And like I said, this is really geared towards builder's risk in the marine course of construction, but I will say it applies to all property insurance. So this is something that carries across both lines. So got to give our artistic marketing people a little plug here. This is what I would call a fully engulfed fire. Hopefully none of you have experienced that. But that is why we're here to talk about this. And protection class is something that is really geared towards fire. But there's some of the principles we talk about today. Could talk about crime rating and even catastrophic areas and the way the insurance industry looks at property. So once again, we're going to talk about protection classes today. First of all, you hear the term ISO talking about a lot. Insurance service organization. An ISO is a servicing company. They're not an insurance company. They're not a government entity. They are a company that provides guidance, I guess I would say, guidance to the insurance industry. So we're going to get into that as we talk about it a little bit. But they are the nationally recognized rating bureau. We're not going to get into some of the other ones that are out there today. There are other ones, and even some individual states have their own protection class system. We're not going to get into that today. We're going to stick to ISO protection classes. And we have seen a few of the largest carriers out there kind of deviate from this a little bit and create their own protection class system. What's interesting is I've seen those. I've seen the other rating bureaus from the different states, and they're all pretty close to ISO. So I think they've done a good job of this, of evaluating the fire risk around the United States. So what are the factors that influence the protection class a territory is assigned? And I want to cover that very quickly too. As far as a territory, a lot of times it's not a fire department rating. It kind of is, but it really isn't. It's really an address rating. So if you think about it, we could have a home on one side of the street that gets one class, and because of distance to the fire hydrant or distance to the fire department, literally across the street could be a different class. So just keep in mind there is a line in the sand at a property level. So that's very, very important. So we're going to talk about the factors that affect this, and it's pretty simplistic. 3 major factors affect this. First one is the fire department quality. And when you talk about fire department quality, a lot of it's response time, the equipment, how well it's maintained. It's just everything you would think about is how you would evaluate how effective and efficient an individual fire department is. Okay, and that is 50% of the classification rating is based on the quality of the fire department. The second thing is the water supply system. So that could be the fire hydrants, how close is the fire hydrant, or if it's not a fire hydrant, a credible body of water that they can extract water from. So it's based on water supply. And unless you have a tanker truck, it's based on the water pressure is even a factor that's part of this too. So the water supply system is 40% of the rating. And then 10% is the actual communication systems. How quickly do they get notified, not just their response time, but the fire alarm systems itself. So those are the 3 major factors that we'll kind of refer to every once in a while. Just remember distance to the fire department, and that's by the road, not as the crow flies, because fire engines don't fly, they stay on the road. So throw that one in there for you. And we'll talk about water supply as we get into it. So let's talk about higher classes. So before we get into it, we have classes 1 through 10. And just to give you an idea, 1 would be excellent, the best you can be, and 10 is basically no fire protection at all. And there's different reasons why something becomes a 10, and we'll talk about that. So I guess if anything, remember, a 1 is really good and 10 is not so good. Now the impact on premium, or the impact on the rates, I guess you would say, is dramatic. Many times going from a 1 to 10 can be 2, 3, 4 times the rate, if not more. So it has a direct and dramatic impact on the pricing, depending on if it's a 1 or a 10, put it that way. Eligibility, once again, there's a lot of carriers that will not write any what they consider unprotected risk. Unprotected is class 9 and 10. We'll define that in a minute. But so a lot of companies have like a tiered rating system where if it's a 1 to 5, it gets one rate. If it's a 6, 7, and 8, it gets a rate. 9 and 10 get a different rate. So it definitely impacts the rates and the pricing on this. And I threw out capacity in there because you'll have a lot of carriers that will say, you know, we'll write a $10 million building unless it's a 9 or a 10, and then we'll only do $1 million. So it directly impacts not only eligibility, whether they do or not, but how much they'll do. So, I mean, that's why it's critical to understand what is a protection class. And then we're going to talk about how you find out what an individual property's protection class is. That's critical too. I'm going to touch just a second on split classes, and I'm going to give you a real life example on that. We had a risk submitted the other day in Montana, and it was a rural town of Montana. And it was said that when you looked at the territory of the fire department, it was either class 5 or a class 9. I was like, that's interesting. So what we had to do is we had a really nice single family home being built. I'm going to say it was around $5 million. If it had been a 9, probably wouldn't have fit our program's appetite. But I mapped it, I looked at it, and determined that because of the distance to the fire department and the fire hydrants in the area, that did qualify as a 5, and we were able to do it. But if it had been, you know, a little distance further from the fire department, it would have been a 9 and not been eligible. So you need to understand that. And a lot of times that's the number one criteria, is the distance to the fire department. And that's the distance, shortest distance by road. And 5 miles is the key there. If any risk is over 5 miles from a fire department, it's more than likely going to be a 9 or a 10. That's just a little rule of thumb. So hopefully everybody understands split classes. You'll see a 5-9. They now have a new, or you might see a 5 or a 5S. All that means is that there's two different classes within the same territory, and you have to map the risk. Brush fire territories and the impact on protection class. Thought I'd throw that in there because those of you in the western states have been having a little brush fire activity over the last several months, California in particular, but it's really all the western states. And one thing we've noticed is the first things that are impacted are the unprotected areas. So when you get out away from the communities and there's farmland or forestry or whatever's going on, those are the first properties that are impacted by brush fire. So this 9 and 10 is a very risky business, let's say, for an underwriter to write in the western states. Because as we're going to talk a little bit more about what exactly is in the class, but if it's a long ways from the fire department and the water supply is not credible, what do you think happens when there's a brush fire? Then you get things like this picture. So the effect of urban sprawl. I put that one on there because over the years I've been seeing, you know, what happens a lot of times is a city grows, maybe the city proper is a protection class 3 or even better, but they're starting to develop, the suburbs are being developed, and they go in and put a subdivision, they start building houses, but maybe the infrastructure is not there yet. The fire hydrants aren't where they should be, or the water supply is not where they should be. So I've seen some fairly large cities that have, say, a 3 in the proper, and they'll actually be a 10 in some of their new subdivisions. There was an article in our local newspaper recently about a brand new subdivision, really nice homes being built, but it was an ISO protection class 10, and their homeowners rates were 3 times that of the city. So you might have to address that with some of your insureds. And once again, you know, we as carriers don't make the rules. ISO sets the rating, and we have to go by that. And just a little trick of the trade. I get agents, good buddies of mine, and they'll say, Jeff, it's a 10, but it's really a 3. I'm like, yeah, I hear you. I can empathize a little bit, but it is what it is. So, and it takes time to reevaluate. So what happens is the city has to resubmit to ISO in order to get reclassified. And sometimes that takes a little bit of time. So you will have some time where it's a 10, and it might not be fully a 10, but usually most underwriters say, I got to go with what ISO has written down, which is a 10. So just kind of the world we live in. Impact of mountainous terrain. These are things that a lot of agents don't think about. A lot of times we get high value buildings being built, mostly single family dwellings. Had one the other day that was $60 million, single family dwelling being built in a protection class 10 on top of a mountain. So you want to talk about something that would make an underwriter stay up at night. So let's think about the mountainous terrain. So even if it's within 5 miles of a fire hydrant, but it's on top of a mountain, what happens in the western states, in the cold weather states in the winter? We get something called snow and ice. So do you think the fire engine can make it up the mountain in the middle of the winter? Maybe, maybe not. So then you think, okay, credible body of water. They're building this $60 million house right next to a lake. Oh, that's great. We have all the water we need for the pumper truck. We can suck the water out of the lake. Oh, what happens in the winter to the lake in December and January? It freezes. So how are you going to pump the water out if it's frozen? So just a little thing that, these are the kind of things that those type of risks usually end up at Lloyd's. And that's why some common sense you don't think about. So we get a lot of high value dwellings submitted in higher protection classes, and we just have to take a hard look at them because the vast majority of these are frame construction, and we'll touch on that in a second too. But obviously, this is the most impact on frame. If you're building a masonry non-combustible building and it's a 9 or 10, we're not quite as concerned. We're still concerned as underwriters, but it's really the frame construction. So when you have high value coupled with limited protection, you have a lot of exposure. Same thing with smaller towns and rural communities. I'm going to talk about fire departments in a second, but you get a small town that doesn't have the resources to really have the latest, greatest fire trucks or the equipment. So that could affect the rating. Maybe they're trying to cover a larger territory, so that can definitely impact the rating. So you get a lot of the rural areas that have 9 or 10. I did see recently a map of the United States, and they had all the colors in with the different classes. And there's not as much 9 and 10 as there used to be, say, 25 years ago, just because everything's being developed and they are putting in fire departments all the time. But where you see it is usually in the Midwest, in the rural areas, and the western mountain states, and some of the mountains in the East Coast. It's usually high terrain creates these unprotected areas. So for those agents in those areas, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Let's talk for a second about a fire department. We have something called a volunteer fire department. Usually in a rural area, they can't fund a full-time fire department. So they have volunteers that man it, and there's a whole criteria of how those fire departments are rated. I will say, I saw one the other day, a volunteer fire department that within its jurisdiction had a protection class 3. And that was unusual, but it was very good. They have it manned all the time. Their equipment is maintained perfectly. So even though it's harder for a volunteer to get a better rating, volunteer fire department, they can do it. And there are areas that do it. And then there's the career fire departments that we're used to. These are the people that are full-time firefighters. It's manned all the time. That's primarily what we're looking at. One thing I was going to touch on a little bit about the distribution of the classes around the United States. And of all the rating territories of the 1 through 10, the most populous class is protection class 5. That's good to know that there's almost 10,000 territories rated protection class 5. Going from there, the next class is 6. Going from there is 4. So between 4, 5, and 6, that is the vast majority of the United States. That's where they fall. Now, interesting enough, the next most populous class is protection class 9, which is considered unprotected. So as an individual class, there is a lot of 9 out there. Like I said, usually in the mountainous areas and the rural areas where most of the 9s lie. Just to give you an idea, there's only 329 territories in the United States to get a protection class 1. And so it's kind of rare to get that out of all of them. So how can I find a protection class? Let's go through this really quick, because this is the technical definition. Pull this down here of what these classes are. So, and some of this is semantics, just how carriers look at it. Usually protection class 1 through 5 is considered fully protected by most all underwriters. And that would be for inland marine and real property, personal lines, commercial lines, it doesn't really matter. 1 to 5 is protected. Partially protected would be 6 through 8. Some companies have a different rating base for 6 to 8. It's obviously higher than protected, but lower than unprotected. And the real kicker is the unprotected, 9 and 10. And you can see what makes it a 9. It has to do with the water supply and the distance to the fire department. So, once you fall into that protection class 9, the rates go up dramatically. And when it goes all the way to a 10, there's going to be limited capacity in the marketplace for a 10. You're going to find less and less companies wanting to play on the 10s. Good news is, as time goes on, there is less 10s than there's ever been, and that is going down. So, how can I find a protection class? I could ask the group that. Now, the easiest way I have found is actually to call the local fire department. And a lot of times you can call and give them the address, and they'll say that's the protection class 3. Because even though the rating is not the fire department only, let's just say your fire department is a 3. So long as it falls within 5 miles of that fire department, and there's a fire hydrant within 1,000 feet of that risk, it's going to be a 3. I can see where there'd be some issues with the urban sprawl I talked about earlier. So if you have any questions, I'd always say call your underwriter and have a discussion, because the bottom line is you want to classify it correctly. Are there mistakes made? Absolutely. Sometimes you thought it was an 8 and it really was a 9. You just don't want to be the agent on those accounts, because eventually you're going to hurt your relationship with your carrier. So it's kind of like, the way I look at it is it's a joint effort. We want to get the right class, the right premium for the exposure. And that's really all you're talking about. And what is interesting over time is, for the risks that are classified correctly, and this is anecdotal, but you can quote me if you want. My name's Jeff Benson, but the 9 and 10 actually performs pretty well over time. And the reason it does is because you get an adequate rate for that. So as long as you're getting the right classification on the risk, which is 2 to 3 times the rate of a protected risk, over time, if you write enough of it, you'll probably be okay from an underwriting standpoint. It is riskier, no doubt about it. It's probably twice the risk from a fire standpoint. So hopefully you're all hanging with me on this. I think that might have been, let's see what I got here. Yeah, that actually was my talk today. Got you out of here in 20 minutes as far as protection classes. Hopefully I helped you out. I do have a couple stories to tell you before we finish, and then we'll open it up for questions. I wrote a risk a number of years ago, and I'll tell the story. But it was a $9 million risk, frame protection class 9, I believe. It was either 9 or a 10, but I want to say this one was a 9. And I did my homework as an underwriter. I got the information on the local volunteer fire department. They had just purchased a new truck. It was, met all the latest standards. There was actually a pond right next to the home where it was being built. It was not in a cold climate. So I said, man, this is a good risk. I got a lot of premium for it. We're off and running. The home was 95% complete, $9 million home. A fire started in the basement of this home. The response time was phenomenal. Volunteer fire department got there within minutes. I mean, it was great, but guess what? They brought the wrong truck. So they didn't have the right equipment to extract the water from the pond. So they sat there and they had a nice video of the structure, kind of like our first picture today, fully engulfed. It was a total loss. So to say the least, as underwriters have a little bias to what's happened to them personally. So I have had a $9 million frame building burned down in protection class 9, simply because the fire department brought the wrong equipment. So it does happen. We do see these things. That was kind of one of my protection class stories. So even though I did everything right, that there is more risk in this exposure. So hopefully this helped you guys out today. What I'd like to do now is open it up to questions to see if anybody has something they want clarified.
Jeff, the first question is, ISO issues a protection class list. How do we get a copy of that list?
Excellent question. So it goes back to where do I get the protection class? So to give you a little background, ISO used to be very free with their lists, and they'd send out CDs, and then they decided a number of years ago that it was proprietary information. So you have to actually Silver Plume is something I know you got a lot of agents have, and I do believe they have a protection class built into Silver Plume. But the bottom line is they're not going to give it away for free. They used to give you maps, but I think what happened is, keep in mind, protection class is down to a very granular level, back to that one side of the street, and the maps are changing all the time. So, if you have a question on individual risk, number one, I would call the local fire department, or I would call your underwriter to see if they can assist you in getting the class on that risk. So there really is, it's not free anymore. You got to find it somehow.
Next question is a volunteer fire department considered less valued than paid fire department?
I gave you that one example because I think I've seen a volunteer. I know I've seen them down to a protection class 3 volunteer. Normally they are in a rural area and they're not rated as high because they just can't be. They don't have the equipment budget. Maybe they're not manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So usually they're a higher class, but some of them out there are not. There are some very good ones. So it just depends on the individual fire department. Just depends, I guess. That's the answer.
Next one is, what other resources are available to verify a protection class?
Yeah, I figured we might get on that one. Like I said, I do know agents. I do know some agents that can access protection class through either Silver Plume or Risk Meter. There's companies out there that do it. But a lot of times the agents are relying on the carriers to do it. So they have to call and say, I'm writing a $5 million building at 123 Main Street in Valdosta, Georgia. What's the protection class? And the company will give it to you. So the worst thing you can do is make one up. Don't do that. That's never a good thing.
Jeff, what is the best source of fire hydrant distance other than the owner of the location or the fire department?
Like I said, there are companies out there. We personally, as our program, we use CoreLogic Risk Meter, and that will give us the distance to the fire department. Now, the fire hydrant is a different story. That one, sometimes you have to rely on, the street level stuff. What does, the builder might know, the builder should know if they're building a house or building a commercial building, where's the nearest fire hydrant. But distance to the fire department, you can get that. There are companies out there that do that. So, like I said, it's just proprietary information, so it's not something that's readily available, unfortunately, but we have to dig a little bit. But I always go back to that. I think when in doubt, pick up the phone and call your underwriter. And if you work it out together too, then the file's documented. And so if the underwriter said, I agree it's a 5, then you as an agent are off the hook because the underwriter told you it was a 5. So that's what I would do. And this is, I don't want to give you the wrong idea here, but usually companies have groups of rates. So 1 to 5 this is the rate, and 6 to 8, here's the rate, 9 and 10, here's the rate. So if you tell an underwriter it's a 4 and it turns out to be a 5, probably not a big deal. If you tell an underwriter it's a 4 and it's a 9, it's a big deal. So it's all a matter of, let's just try to get as close as we can. Ideally, we'd like to be perfect, but I think that gives you the idea.
Jeff, what does it mean when there's a letter after the protection class number?
Good question. I was reading about that. I date myself sometimes. When I talk about split classes, you see 5/9 or 6/10. They've changed that around in some of the country now. So instead of saying 5/9, it'll say 5/5S. So it just means it's a split class. Usually it depends on the distance to the fire department and the water supply as far as the fire hydrant itself. So it's just split class when you see a letter after it.
Who and what determines the quality of the fire department?
ISO does that. It's a pretty involved process. It's evaluated on a number of factors, and they assign points to each factor. And the most they can get is like 105.5 points. But each classification, you have to get so many points. So in order to be a 3, you got to have so many points. I do know that the most you can get, the perfect fire department, is 105.5. But they evaluate it based on anything you could think of. Like I said, from the training of the staff to the quality of the equipment, the maintenance of the equipment. But ISO does that. They're the rating service. And they've been doing it a long time. They have quite a database. I will say it's a big deal. I was reading today too, when a community gets improved protection class, they can, they put more money into the fire department. They built more fire departments. They bought new equipment. I mentioned Valdosta, Georgia a little while ago, a little town in rural Georgia, but they are now protection class 1. And they were very proud of that. It was like a lead story in their paper that we now are protection class 1, and your insurance premium should be going down over time. Now, ISO is very quick to tell everyone they do not set the rates. All they do is provide the information, and the carriers set their own rates, as you guys know. I just want to make sure ISO doesn't come up with the premium rates or anything else. They just have the classification based on the quality of all those different factors. Hopefully that helps. I like that. You're all stunned. So once again, 30 minutes. Is that it? No more questions?
Yeah, I have more. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Do carriers request ISO building inspections?
There used to be like individual fire rates per building and things of that nature. I would think a carrier might, based on the value, but it usually comes down to individual loss control. So, if there's so much of a value, they might order a loss control before they quote it. So it's really not an individual. ISO does more of a territory rating than an individual risk rating. So I would say no. I would answer that question and say no.
Jeff, the next question is, what is the protection class for a home that is on well water? 6 to 8 within reasonable distance to fire department, 9 if not, question mark.
You guys are pinning me down here. ISO is probably recording this saying I'm going to give you bad information, but I do know it comes down to the main criteria. Number 1 is going to be distance to the fire department by road. It's got to be within 5 miles. And number 2 is going to be the credibility of the water supply. So like a well, I guess they would have to determine the water pressure. So it comes down to the pumps that are on the well. Because let's say you had a great well, but your pump broke. It's kind of like my frozen lake. It doesn't put out many fires if you don't have a good pump. So that would be kind of a tricky one, based on that well. I do know I've seen neighborhoods that are in rural areas that either have big tanks because they don't have any fire hydrants, no city water, and they can get rated too based on the quality of the tank where they keep the water in. These are like 50,000 gallon water tanks. Chances are though, if it's on a well water, it's going to be a 9 or a 10. Probably. I do know they have some classes I've seen, 8B, which is in between an 8 and a 9, and there's kind of a criteria there. That might be the best it could do. And I did recently read about a 10W. So you have a 10, which basically means no fire protection, no water supply. And then you have a 10W, which means there's no hydrants, they're over 5 miles, but they're not too much further than 5 miles, and there is a credible water supply, be it a lake, a pond, or something, swimming pool or something. But so there is a 10W, which might help a little bit in the rating. Hopefully that helps.
That's all the questions.
Fantastic. Well, I really appreciate your time today. We tried to keep this very educational. I will say a brief little commercial for our program. We are Victor Builders Risk. We love to write Builders Risk. We write it coast to coast. We do write in all protection classes. We do want to make sure it's classified correctly. And we ask the appropriate underwriting questions. But if you have any questions or anything regarding protection class or builder's risk or anything we've talked about in past webinars, do not hesitate to contact me or Donna. We'd love to hear from you, and I hope you guys have a great day, and we'll be doing another one in the near future, another topic. So have a great day and take care. Bye.